It began with a voice on an old answering machine. In February 2020, a sheriff's deputy in Kearney, Nebraska, was cleaning out evidence boxes from the late 1990s when he came across a small cassette tape labeled only with the date, March 9th, 1998. The handwriting was smudged, but still legible. When he played it, a woman's voice came through the static, low and trembling. "He's here again. If something happens to me, please tell them it was..." The recording cut off mid-sentence. The deputy froze. He checked the property log. The tape had been entered as evidence in connection to a missing person case, one that hadn't been touched in over 20 years. The name on the file read, Emily Frost, age 32, last seen March 8, 1998. That single tape would reopen one of Nebraska's most haunting disappearances and expose a truth that no one in the quiet farming town of Lexington wanted to believe. Emily Frost had been a schoolteacher, mother of two, and part-time volunteer at the local library. On the night she vanished, the temperature dropped below freezing. She left a parent-teacher conference just after 7 p.m., drove toward home and never made it back. Her car, a tan Ford Taurus, was found the next morning parked neatly behind the old Red Willow grain elevator, a mile from the highway. Inside were her teaching supplies, her handbag, and a cup of coffee that had frozen solid overnight. No signs of struggle. No broken glass. No blood. The only oddity was the position of the driver's seat, pushed back too far for Emily's height. In 1998, Detective Paul Ridley led the search. Ridley was old school, a man who believed in long interviews and short patience. He canvassed the area for days, knocking on every door within a 5-mile radius. Witnesses remembered little. One man claimed he saw a dark pickup truck parked near the elevator around 8 p.m. Another reported hearing a woman's voice echoing through the cold, something about being followed. But without physical evidence, the case collapsed into silence. Emily's husband, Mark Frost, was questioned repeatedly but never charged. He passed 2 polygraphs and maintained the same story for years. Emily had been anxious about someone watching her classroom after hours, but he assumed it was her imagination. By 2000, with no body and no leads, the Frost case was officially labeled cold. For 2 decades, life moved on. Detective Ridley retired. The Frost children grew up and moved away. The old police station digitized its records, boxing the old tapes and reports in a dark basement corner, until that day in 2020, when the deputy pressed play. The voice on the cassette didn't sound hysterical. It sounded terrified in a controlled way, like someone who had practiced what to say. Finishing the line through audio restoration, forensic engineers enhanced the muffled final seconds. Beneath the static, faintly, another sound emerged, the low hum of an idling truck engine. The recording was sent to the Nebraska State Crime Lab. Technicians cleaned and digitized it, isolating background frequencies. They identified a specific mechanical pattern. The idling engine belonged to a 1990 Dodge Ram, one of only 18 registered in Dawson County that year. When cold case investigator Sergeant Natalie Reese took over, she began cross-referencing the original 1998 witness statements with those registrations. One name stood out immediately: Roy Sanders. Back then, Sanders had been a part-time mechanic who lived 5 miles from the grain elevator. He had a long history of domestic complaints and had worked on the Frost family's vehicle several times. His name had been mentioned once in the 1998 file, in a single line of a supplemental report written by Ridley. Neighbor reports male in Dodge Ram parked near Frost residence night before disappearance. No probable cause for follow-up. That no probable cause note would come back to haunt the department. Reese drove to interview Sanders in February 2020. He was 70 now, quiet, thin, and living alone in a mobile home on the edge of Lexington. When she mentioned Emily Frost, he flinched almost imperceptibly. "I don't remember much about her," he said. That was a long time ago, but Reese had come prepared. She played the restored audio clip on her phone. The faint hum of the truck, the woman's trembling voice. Sanders's hands tightened on the armrest. "She's lying," he muttered. "She always was." Reese leaned forward. "What do you mean, always?" He stared at the table for a long time, then said quietly, "People forget things after 20 years. But the ground doesn't." That line sent shivers through her, 2 days later, the sheriff's office obtained a search warrant for Sanders's property. The backyard was small, uneven, littered with rusting car parts and broken tools. Ground-penetrating radar revealed 3 areas of disturbed soil behind the old shed. 1 large, 2 smaller. On March 12, 2020, forensic teams began excavation. At 2 feet down, they found a strip of cloth consistent with a woman's blouse from the late 1990s. At 4 feet, they uncovered a partial skeleton, bound with electrical wire. Dental records confirmed the impossible. It was Emily Frost. Her body had been buried 22 years beneath the soil she used to drive past every day on her way to school. The position of her remains suggested restraint, wrists bound behind her back. Consistent with abduction, the coroner found trace evidence of antifreeze compounds in the bone marrow, a slow, deliberate poisoning. When confronted with the autopsy results, Sanders said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, she shouldn't have left the tape. She said she'd destroy it. She never did. That was his confession. News broke across Nebraska the next morning. 1998. Lexington. Cold case solved. Suspect arrested after 22 years. The Frost children, now adults, returned to attend the press conference. Their mother's photograph, smiling, frozen in time, appeared on every local broadcast. Detective Reese stood before the cameras and said, "This case proves something simple. Truth doesn't expire. It just waits for the right ears to listen." But privately, she knew there was still one part of the mystery left unsolved. If the tape was made before Emily died, then who placed it in the evidence box months after her case had already gone cold? The second tape was found by accident. 3 weeks after Roy Sanders's arrest, the Lexington Police Department received a box from the Midwest Storage Archive in Omaha, one of hundreds of legacy files being transferred back to their original jurisdictions. The label was faded, but inside were school records from Lexington Elementary, where Emily Frost had taught 3rd grade. At the bottom of that box, tucked inside a manila folder marked Curriculum 1998, investigators found another cassette. Unmarked this time, the tape brittle and half-melted. When technicians restored the audio, a familiar voice returned. It was Emily. Her tone was quieter now, deliberate, like she knew time was running out. "If you're hearing this, it means he came back. His name is Roy. He said he fixed my car last week, but I think he did something to it. There's something wrong with the engine. Please, check under the seat." Then, faintly in the background, a knock at the door. 3 taps. A man's voice. "Miss Frost? You forgot your keys." The tape ended in silence. Detective Natalie Reese had heard countless recordings in her career. Emergency calls, confessions, interrogations. But this was different. It wasn't panic. It was resignation. Emily Frost had known she was going to die. The team immediately searched for her 1998 Ford Taurus, which had been auctioned and scrapped decades earlier. Records showed the vehicle had been purchased at salvage by a local yard, and that same yard was still operating under new management. Reese and 2 technicians went there the next morning. The owner, Caleb Myers, led them through rows of rusted metal skeletons until they reached a section labeled pre-2000. Half buried under snow and brush sat the crushed frame of a Ford Taurus. The VIN number matched Emily's. Beneath what used to be the driver's seat, wedged into the floor pan, they found a folded piece of paper sealed in plastic. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "If I disappear, don't believe Mark." That sentence detonated like a bomb through the investigation. For 22 years, everyone had assumed Emily's husband. Mark Frost was innocent, grief-stricken, cooperative, the quiet widower who'd moved to Lincoln and remarried. He'd even given interviews to local news over the years, pleading for justice. Now Reese wasn't sure what to believe. She ordered a full review of his 1998 statements. They discovered that Mark and Roy Sanders had known each other, not just casually but personally. Mark's car had been serviced at Roy's shop 3 times in the months before Emily's disappearance. And according to receipts, the last repair on Emily's vehicle had been paid in cash. The next question was why. Reese flew to Lincoln to confront Mark Frost. He lived in a quiet suburb with his second wife, a retired nurse, and worked as an accountant. When she knocked on his door, he looked genuinely surprised. "I heard about Roy," he said. "I can't believe he did it." Emily trusted that man. Reese didn't answer. She placed the plastic bag on the table, inside the note with his name written in Emily's hand. The blood drained from his face. I don't understand, he whispered. Reese slid another photo forward, a 1997 bank record showing a $15,000 withdrawal from the Frosts' joint account, dated 2 weeks before Emily disappeared. The money had never been accounted for. I think you paid him, Reese said. I think you hired Roy Sanders to follow her, maybe scare her, but it went further than you planned. Mark's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. And that was all the confession they needed. In recorded testimony, Mark Frost claimed he'd discovered Emily's affair with a local colleague, something investigators never fully verified. In anger, he confronted Roy Sanders, who'd been doing odd jobs for the Frosts for years. I just wanted her scared, Mark admitted, not hurt. Roy said he'd talk to her, tell her he'd been hired to watch her so she'd back off. I thought it would be over, but it wasn't. Sanders confronted Emily that night. Something went wrong, a struggle, a blow, panic. When Mark realized what had happened, Sanders told him it was handled. For 22 years, both men had lived with that secret, one burying the body, the other burying his guilt. The district attorney charged Roy, Sanders with first-degree murder, and Mark Frost with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The trial in Buffalo County Court became one of Nebraska's most watched proceedings. Every seat was filled. On the stand, Sanders appeared frail, trembling, his voice uneven. He told me she was leaving him, he said. Said she was taking the kids. I didn't mean to. Reese sat in the gallery, expressionless. She'd heard it all before, the excuses, the half-truths, the decades of silence. When the verdict came, it was swift. Sanders, guilty. Life without parole. Frost, guilty. 25 years for conspiracy. For the Frost children, it was closure and devastation in one breath. They'd lost both parents to the same truth, one murdered, one condemned. On the day of sentencing, Reese stood outside the courthouse as snow began to fall, the same kind of soft white silence that had covered Emily's car 22 years earlier. Reporters surrounded her, asking the same question, what made this case finally break? She looked straight into the camera and said, a voice that refused to stay buried. Behind her, inside the courtroom, the evidence boxes from 1998 sat stacked neatly on a table, each labeled Frost. Emily closed. But as Reese turned to leave, her phone buzzed with a new message from the state lab. They'd found another DNA sample on the second tape, one that didn't match either Sanders or Frost. A woman's, and she wasn't Emily. The DNA didn't belong to Emily. Frost. It belonged to someone who wasn't supposed to exist in the case file at all. The lab report listed it as unknown female number 2. The EDOI sample came from a single fingerprint, a faint ridge impression, found on the plastic cassette tape itself, sealed under decades of dust. When cross-checked through the state database, it hit on a name that no one expected. Claire Manning. She'd been 21 in 1998, a student at the community college just outside Lexington. And she had gone missing 6 months before Emily Frost. Her case had never been connected. Different age, different lifestyle, and no link to the Frost family. Until now. Detective Natalie Reese drove to the archives the next morning, digging out the Manning case file, a thin folder buried among dozens of unsolved disappearances. Claire had been last seen leaving her evening shift at Peterson's Diner, walking toward the bus stop 2 blocks away. Her apron and ID badge were later found in a drainage ditch near County Road 6, the same road that led directly to Roy Sanders's repair shop. In 1998, it had been written off as a transient disappearance, but now with the DNA match, everything pointed back to Sanders again. Reese couldn't shake the feeling that Emily Frost hadn't been his only victim. She'd just been the one whose case refused to fade. The deeper she dug, the more twisted the connections became. Roy Sanders's employment records showed that from 1996 to 1999, he'd done contract work for several businesses, including Midwest Storage Archive, the same facility where Emily's second tape had surfaced. That meant the tape could have been planted. Reese realized the terrifying possibility. Someone had wanted the Frost case reopened. Someone who'd been alive long after 1998. Someone who'd handled that tape in recent years. But who? She started re-examining every person who had access to the evidence vault. Most were retired or deceased, except one Deputy Tom Keller, the man who'd found the first tape in 2020. He'd joined the department in 2005, long after the original investigation, and he'd been the one to notify the state lab when the recording was discovered. Reese ordered a quiet background check. Keller had a clean record, strong service history, but an odd personal detail. He'd been married, briefly, to Claire Manning's cousin. Back in the early 2000s, that connection was enough for a warrant. Reese and her team searched Keller's property on April 14, 2020. In his garage, behind stacks of labeled evidence boxes he'd borrowed for personal study, they found something no one expected, a wooden crate filled with audio cassettes. Dozens of them, each one labeled by location and date. Some bore the initials of known missing women across central Nebraska. When they played them, the pattern became clear. Each tape contained fragments of women's voices, journal entries, conversations, confessions. But over them all was another voice, faint and steady, asking questions. A man's voice. Tell me what you see outside. What did he say to you? Do you trust me? Reese froze. The audio quality was distorted but unmistakable. It wasn't Roy Sanders. It was Tom Keller. The truth unraveled, fast and brutal. Keller hadn't discovered the tapes and he'd planted them. He'd used his position in the evidence room to manipulate cold case files, inserting discoveries that pointed toward older suspects, men like Sanders, effectively rewriting history while appearing to solve it. When Sanders was arrested, Keller had been the first to volunteer for transport duty. He'd sat beside the man he was framing, asking casual questions, collecting new recordings to edit into the old ones later. It was methodical, sociopathic, and chillingly intelligent. But the motive was stranger still. According to recovered journal entries, Keller had become obsessed with unsolved cases after his cousin Claire disappeared. He'd grown convinced the justice system would never bring closure. So he decided to manufacture it himself, targeting old suspects, planting physical evidence, and orchestrating breakthroughs that gave families a sense of peace. He called it restorative truth. But somewhere along the line, his obsession turned darker. When he found Emily Frost's tape among unprocessed archives, he saw an opportunity. By linking it to Sanders, he could complete a cold case narrative that had haunted the region for years. He hadn't known Mark Frost was guilty. That was coincidence, cruel symmetry. But the DNA from Claire Manning's fingerprint had exposed his fabrication. When Keller was arrested, he didn't resist. He looked at Reese and said, "You're welcome. You think anyone cares if the wrong man went to prison?" They needed an ending. He smiled as they led him away, his eyes full of something between pride and madness. Roy Sanders died of heart failure in custody 2 months later, never knowing he'd been a pawn in another man's delusion. Mark Frost's conviction was overturned posthumously when he took his own life in prison. The state launched a full investigation into Keller's restorative truth operation, linking him to at least 5 manipulated cases across Nebraska and Kansas. The final tape, labeled simply End File, was recovered from Keller's safe deposit box. It contained a single voice message, time-stamped 3 days before his arrest. "I did what the system couldn't. They all wanted stories that end neatly. I just gave them closure. After that, static." Detective Natalie Reese closed her final report on June 9, 2021, exactly 23 years and 3 months after Emily Frost vanished. She'd solved a murder that wasn't a mystery, uncovered a truth that wasn't pure, and watched justice twist into something unrecognizable. When reporters asked if she believed the case was truly closed, she said only this: "Cold cases don't die. They evolve. And sometimes they evolve faster than justice." The camera zoomed in on Emily's photo behind her, smiling, young, untouched by time, before fading to black.